29F here. Just want to share the weirdest and most messed up family drama that I never thought would get this out of hand. I grew up in a small suburban town, an only child, with two parents who weren't rich but always made sure I felt loved. They were the kind of parents who'd come home from work tired but still managed to make dinner together, or help me with homework. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was good enough for me. Looking back, it's wild how much I missed about what was really going on. I never had to worry about money. My maternal grandparents were wealthy, but they weren't flashy about it. They had this humble charm about them, and treated me like I was the most important person in the world. They weren't just the occasional gift-giving kind of grandparents. They were the kind who paid for my school tuition, signed me up for piano lessons, and made sure I could join every extracurricular activity I wanted to. They made it clear that they just wanted to see me happy. At first, I thought it was just their way of showing love, but there were moments, even when I was a kid, that felt a little off, like how my parents would get this weird energy whenever my grandparents would visit. They'd act so excited, like they were seeing royalty or something. And when my grandparents handed me gifts, whether it was cash for school or just some small trinket, they'd look at me like they expected me to do cartwheels of gratitude, even though I hadn't asked for any of it. I was 10 when my grandparents bought me my first real big gift, a grand piano. The thing was beautiful and I loved it, but there was this strange moment where my parents insisted it be placed in the living room as family decor. I mean, who uses a piano as decor? It was like they didn't want me actually using it. Looking back, it's obvious they wanted to show off that their daughter was getting all this stuff, but there was no intention of me ever really having the chance to enjoy it. By the time I hit 12, things started changing. My parents' attitude toward me was different when my grandparents weren't around. They'd become colder. Not in an outright hostile way, but in these little ways that didn't make sense. No more hugs just because, no more checking in on me in the evenings. They seemed to be distant. When I'd ask them about it, they'd say they were just busy, but I knew it wasn't just that. And then came the teenage years, where things got a lot more complicated. My grandparents started paying for bigger things like private school tuition, summer camps, and eventually a car. My parents never seemed happy about it. I remember overhearing one of their arguments. My dad was saying, "We shouldn't have to rely on them. They're buying her love." And my mom was saying something like she doesn't even appreciate what they're doing for her. I just stayed quiet. I was a teenager and I didn't want to get involved, but I could feel this weird resentment building between them and me. The worst moment came when I turned 16. My grandparents offered to fund my college education. I remember the way my parents reacted. They immediately shut it down, claiming they could handle it, that they didn't want anyone else's money involved in my future. My grandparents agreed to compromise by putting the money in a trust for me, so I wouldn't have to feel guilty about it. But from that point forward, things between my parents and me went from bad to worse. They started making me feel like I owed them for basic things, like the roof over my head, the food on the table, even the electricity in my room. Everything was a transaction now, and I could sense the bitterness growing. It was around this time that my parents started bad-mouthing me to their friends, telling everyone how expensive I was, as if it was somehow my fault that I wasn't able to pay for my own college tuition or car insurance at 16. Their words cut deep, even though I was still young enough to not fully understand what they were doing. I remember, on my graduation day, my grandparents were there, so proud of me. They wanted to take photos, and they did. But my parents barely stayed for the ceremony. They left early, barely acknowledging it, and refused to take photos with me. I was hurt but didn't let it show too much. Right after graduation, my grandparents decided to take the whole family on a luxury vacation. My parents acted like they couldn't care less. They barely spoke to me, and at one point, my dad sarcastically called me the golden child. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at that. A few months later, my grandparents gave me a down payment for my first home. My parents flipped out. They accused me of stealing their inheritance, even though they hadn't contributed a single penny to anything I'd gotten. Their jealousy was so thick you could feel it in the air. That's when they gave me the ultimatum. I was told, in no uncertain terms, that I had to cut ties with my grandparents or else I'd lose their support. By then, I had been on the receiving end of their cold treatment for too long. I refused. I chose to stay loyal to my grandparents, the people who had always been there for me when no one else was. And that right there was the moment everything truly fell apart. Update 1. So, things started to get way out of hand after I refused to cut ties with my grandparents. What I thought was just an issue of jealousy turned into something much bigger, and I was completely blindsided by how far my parents had been willing to go. It all started with an unexpected phone call. I was sitting at home, trying to unwind after a long day at work, when I got a call from my parents' accountant. The guy sounded a little panicked, like he was trying to figure out if he'd made a mistake. He mentioned that he was working on some paperwork for my parents, but there was something about my grandparents' financial contributions to their household that he hadn't known how to handle properly. He dropped this bomb. My grandparents had been giving my parents money for years. I thought I misheard him. My parents never mentioned anything like this, and I figured they would have been upfront about it if it was true. I ended the call quickly, but the damage was done. That night, I called my grandparents to get the full story. They weren't exactly hiding it. In fact, they explained that they'd been quietly helping my parents for as long as I could remember, covering mortgage payments, bills, and even more, all to make sure my parents didn't struggle. They'd done it because they cared about me, and they wanted me to have a stable home life. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents had been taking money from my grandparents without saying a word. They'd always made it seem like they were doing everything on their own. All those times they'd complained about being broke, it was all a lie. So, I confronted them. I didn't even know where to begin, but I couldn't let this slide. I asked them directly about the money they'd been getting from my grandparents. At first, they tried to deny it, but the guilt was written all over their faces. Eventually, they admitted it. They said it was all for my benefit. They claimed that they'd been trying to shield me from the reality of their financial situation. I honestly don't think I've ever felt so betrayed. Here I was, believing they were doing everything they could, when in reality, they'd been relying on my grandparents the entire time. It got worse. They started talking about how they'd always felt like second-class citizens to my grandparents. They said they resented me for taking their attention. My mom even said something about how they always felt like my grandparents preferred me over them. It was like I'd been the source of all their anger. Everything was my fault for getting the love and support they could never seem to get from their own parents. They didn't even seem to care that their jealousy and bitterness had destroyed our relationship. They just kept blaming me. I didn't know what to say. It wasn't like they had any reason to be upset with me, but they made it clear they thought I had something to do with it. They had no problem taking my grandparents' money, but the moment I found out about it, I was the one in the wrong for stirring up trouble. I reached out to my grandparents to tell them what had happened. They were shocked, like they didn't even know how far things had gotten. They had always thought they were helping, and that my parents would use the money responsibly. It was clear now that they had no idea their help was being misused, and they were heartbroken to find out what my parents had been doing behind their backs. As I dug deeper, I started seeing things I couldn't ignore. I discovered that some of the money my grandparents had given my parents wasn't being used for bills or mortgage payments at all. Instead, it was being spent on vacations, home remodels, and all sorts of luxuries. It was like they were living this double life, pretending to be struggling while secretly living high off my grandparents' generosity. I felt sick just thinking about it. Things between me and my parents spiraled from there. They were furious with me for spilling the beans and accused me of being ungrateful for everything they'd done for me. But let's be real here, they hadn't done anything for me. My grandparents had been the ones supporting me all along. My parents tried to manipulate everyone around us, painting me as the bad guy in all of this. They posted a vague status online about how a spoiled child had ruined everything for them. It wasn't even a direct attack, but everyone in our circle knew exactly who they were talking about. Then, my paternal aunt reached out to me. She'd always been somewhat distant from my parents, but now she was telling me things I didn't want to hear. She said my parents had been terrible with money for years, and had always relied on others to bail them out. She even dropped the bomb that they'd tried for more kids but couldn't afford to, and she thought they resented me for being too expensive to raise. It made sense why my parents were so bitter. They never wanted me to be born in the first place. The whole family started getting involved. Some sided with my parents, claiming I was causing drama, while others reached out to me, asking for details about what had really been going on. The gossip spread like wildfire, and the pressure started building. At the same time, I got a job offer for a high-paying position that would have set me up for life. My parents, of course, couldn't handle that either. They were convinced I'd only gotten the job because of their sacrifices. They started demanding that I repay them for everything they'd done for me, putting a ridiculous dollar amount on it. It was insane. My grandparents offered to step in and mediate, but my parents wouldn't have any of it. They accused my grandparents of playing favorites, which only made the situation worse. I couldn't deal with the constant tension anymore, so I decided to cut contact. It wasn't forever, but it was necessary. The emotional and mental toll this had been taking on me was becoming unbearable, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was making the right choice. Update 2. After I cut contact with my parents, things only got messier. It wasn't long before more family secrets started bubbling to the surface, and honestly, I was starting to realize just how deep this rabbit hole went. It began with my paternal aunt. She'd been reaching out to me more since everything blew up, offering little bits of information that left me stunned. One night, during a long phone call, she dropped a bombshell. Before I was born, my parents were drowning in debt. Apparently, they weren't planning to have kids at all because they could barely make ends meet. The only reason they decided to have me was that my grandparents stepped in and offered financial help. They promised to cover a portion of my parents' expenses to make things easier, thinking it would bring the family closer together. Instead, it set the stage for years of manipulation. I asked my grandparents about it, and their response was heartbreaking. They admitted it was true and expressed regret for enabling my parents' behavior. They thought they were helping out of love, but looking back, they realized they'd only made things worse. What hurt the most was hearing how disappointed they were in themselves for not seeing the signs earlier. They told me they'd revised their will recently, specifically to protect me from my parents. They didn't want my parents to manipulate or contest anything after their passing. It was reassuring, but at the same time, it was just sad that things had to come to this. When my parents found out about the will, all hell broke loose. They started threatening legal action, claiming they were entitled to their fair share of the inheritance because of all the emotional labor they'd put into raising me. I couldn't believe they were using that as their argument. They hadn't even been involved in my life in a meaningful way since I was a teenager, and even then, most of the financial support I'd received had come from my grandparents. But logic didn't matter to them. They just saw dollar signs. Around this time, I was going through some old family photos, hoping to find a few good memories to hold on to. Instead, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. In pictures from my childhood, my parents' smiles seemed genuine. But as the years went on, they became more forced. By the time I was in high school, their smiles were practically non-existent. It was like the resentment they felt toward me had been building all along, and now it was written all over their faces. Distant relatives began reaching out to me, some to offer support and others to share their own stories about my parents. It turned out this wasn't the first time my parents had relied on others to bail them out financially. An uncle told me about a loan they'd borrowed years ago and never repaid. A cousin mentioned how my parents had guilt-tripped her family into helping them with a down payment on their first house. The pattern was clear. They'd been using people for as long as anyone could remember. One day, I came home to find a thermos sitting on my doorstep. Inside was a note that read, "You'll need us one day." It was obviously from my mom. She hadn't contacted me directly since I blocked her number, so this was her new way of trying to get under my skin. I threw the thermos away and doubled down on keeping my distance. I blocked them on every platform I could think of, hoping they'd get the message. Instead, they escalated things. A few weeks later, I got a surprise visit from the police. My parents had called for a wellness check, claiming they were worried about me. The officers were polite but clearly uncomfortable, especially when I explained the situation. It was embarrassing, and it only made me more determined to keep them out of my life. Meanwhile, things were going well at work. I hit a major milestone in my career and even won an award. My grandparents were thrilled and celebrated with me, but my parents made no effort to acknowledge it. Instead, they went on Facebook, accusing my grandparents of brainwashing me and turning me against them. Their post was a full-on tirade, claiming they'd been betrayed by their own family. Surprisingly, the post backfired. Childhood friends and even neighbors started commenting, calling them out for their behavior. Some even messaged me privately, offering their support. As their reputation crumbled, so did their financial situation. They defaulted on their mortgage, and when they turned to the extended family for help, no one stepped up. Everyone had finally seen through their manipulative tactics. Despite everything, my grandparents still wanted to help them. They thought about offering to pay off the mortgage, but I convinced them not to. My parents had taken advantage of their kindness for too long, and I wasn't going to let them do it again. The more I reflected on everything, the clearer it became. My parents had only loved me when I was useful to them, when they could use me as leverage to get more money from my grandparents. The moment I started standing up for myself, their true colors came out. They didn't care about me as a person, I was just another tool for them to exploit. Cutting contact had been hard at first, but now it felt like the best decision I'd ever made. For the first time, I could see my life clearly, free from their manipulation. My grandparents and I were closer than ever, and I finally felt like I was building something real for myself. Update 3. It was a Saturday morning when I heard the doorbell. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I peeked through the window. My stomach dropped. It was my parents. I hadn't seen them since I cut contact, and now they were standing on my porch like nothing had happened. I debated not answering, but they weren't leaving. They started knocking and calling my name loudly, making it clear they weren't going anywhere. I opened the door a crack. They pushed their way in, saying they needed to talk. They claimed that cutting them off was tearing the family apart. My dad's tone was angry, while my mom was on the verge of tears. They rambled about how they were my parents and that I had an obligation to them. They accused me of abandoning them and being brainwashed by my grandparents. It was overwhelming and invasive. Before I could process what was happening, my grandparents showed up. A neighbor had spotted my parents causing a scene and called them. My grandparents stepped inside, and the tension in the room became unbearable. My dad's face turned red as he accused them of stealing me away from them. He said they'd been undermining his authority as a parent since I was a child. He went on about how they bought my loyalty by giving me money, gifts, and opportunities he could never provide. My grandfather, usually a calm and reserved man, didn't hold back. He reminded my dad that everything they'd done was out of love, not manipulation, and that if my parents hadn't squandered their own finances, none of this would have been necessary. My mom burst into tears, saying they'd always done their best and that I was being ungrateful for everything they'd sacrificed for me. My dad, meanwhile, remained defiant, calling me selfish and accusing me of choosing money over family. I'd had enough. I told them exactly how I saw it. I pointed out how they had lied to me for years about their finances, how they had used me as a pawn to get money from my grandparents, and how they had treated me more like an investment than a child. I brought up the vacations, the home remodels, the facade they'd built while pretending to struggle. My voice shook as I confronted them about their manipulative behavior and how they'd been nothing but a toxic presence in my life. My dad tried to flip the narrative. He said everything they did was for my benefit, that they'd worked themselves to the bone to give me a good life. But it wasn't adding up anymore, and everyone in the room knew it. My grandparents stood by me, and that seemed to push my parents over the edge. The threats came next. They claimed they'd sue my grandparents for financial damages, though they couldn't even explain what that meant. They threw out vague legal jargon, clearly trying to scare us, but it didn't work. My grandparents contacted their lawyer that same day. Within a week, my parents were served with a cease and desist letter, warning them to stay away from me and to stop making baseless legal threats. Word about the confrontation spread fast. Neighbors, extended family, and even old friends of my parents started hearing about their antics. It didn't take long for people to put the pieces together. My parents' reputation, already shaky, took another hit. They'd always managed to keep their manipulative side hidden from most people, but now the truth was out. Even people who had once defended them were backing away. A few days after the cease and desist, I started receiving strange packages in the mail. They contained old family photos and cryptic notes like, "Don't forget where you came from." It wasn't hard to figure out who was behind it. I documented everything and passed it along to my lawyer, just in case they tried to escalate further. To protect myself, I hired a lawyer to ensure they couldn't contest my grandparents' estate or interfere with my life in any way. My grandparents, meanwhile, made a big decision. They cut off all financial support to my parents. They also updated their will, adding even more protections to ensure my parents couldn't get their hands on anything. It was a heartbreaking step for them, but they knew it was the right thing to do. My parents didn't take it well. They had a full-blown meltdown on social media, accusing me and my grandparents of ruining their lives and abandoning family values. The post was long, dramatic, and filled with lies. But instead of gaining sympathy, they faced backlash. People were fed up with their victim act. During one final heated argument, my dad let something slip. He admitted they had wanted more children but couldn't afford it because I was too expensive to raise. He didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. They blamed me for their financial struggles and their failed dreams. That was the last straw for me. Not long after, my parents' financial situation completely collapsed. They lost their house and had to file for bankruptcy. They tried turning to extended family for help, but no one wanted to bail them out again. Their past behavior had finally caught up to them. I changed the locks on my house, blocked their numbers, and cut them off for good. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. There were no more surprise visits, no more guilt trips, no more manipulative games. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I finally had peace. Update 4. With my parents out of the picture, life began to settle down. I threw myself into work and focused on building a future that didn't revolve around their chaos. My grandparents and I grew closer than ever. We spent more time together, and they became my rock during this transition. They even started seeing a family counselor to work through the guilt they felt over enabling my parents' behavior for so many years. They wanted to understand where things went wrong and how to move forward, which only made me admire them more. But of course, my parents weren't done stirring the pot. Their bankruptcy filing became public knowledge, and in a town as small as ours, it was a huge topic of gossip. People started talking about how they'd overextended themselves for years, living beyond their means and relying on handouts. Old neighbors, acquaintances, and even distant family started whispering about how they'd finally gotten what they deserved. It was a harsh reminder of how far things had fallen, but I stayed out of it. Around that time, my paternal aunt showed up at my door unannounced. She hadn't been close to my parents in years, but she wanted to clear the air. Over coffee, she apologized for not speaking up sooner and confirmed something I'd suspected but never fully understood. My parents had always treated me like a cash cow. From the moment I was born, they saw me as a way to secure more financial help from my grandparents. She even told me stories about how they used to complain about the cost of raising me, as if I were some kind of financial burden instead of their child. It was a hard pill to swallow, but it explained so much. One good thing that came out of all this was reconnecting with other family members. I started talking to cousins and relatives I hadn't seen in years. They shared their own experiences with my parents' manipulative tendencies, and it felt like a weight was lifted. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in this. My parents had burned so many bridges that no one was willing to stick their necks out for them anymore. In the middle of all this, my grandfather had a health scare. It wasn't serious, just a minor issue that required a short hospital stay, but it shook me. It made me realize how much I valued the time I had left with them. We started spending even more time together, and I made a promise to myself to cherish every moment. They had done so much for me, and I wanted to make sure they knew how much I appreciated them. Then came the letter. My parents sent me a handwritten note, begging for forgiveness and asking for money. They claimed they were destitute and needed my help to survive. At first glance, it almost seemed genuine, but as I read further, it became clear it wasn't an apology at all. It was a list of demands wrapped in guilt-tripping language. They talked about how I owed them for raising me and how it was my responsibility to take care of them now that they were struggling. It was infuriating, but also unsurprising. What pushed me over the edge was when they posted the letter online. They framed it as a heartfelt plea to a cold and ungrateful child who had abandoned her parents in their time of need. They even tagged a few mutual friends and relatives, hoping to shame me into responding. But it backfired spectacularly. People started commenting, calling them out for their entitlement and pointing out how they'd used and manipulated everyone around them for years. It was almost cathartic to see the truth laid bare for everyone to see. Meanwhile, my grandparents continued to show their love in ways that mattered. They donated a significant amount of money to a local charity in my name, saying they wanted to honor the bond we shared. It was a beautiful gesture, and it reminded me that not all family relationships are toxic. Some are built on genuine love and support. Of course, my parents weren't done trying to weasel their way back into my life. They started reaching out through mutual friends, claiming they wanted to reconcile, but I saw through their tactics. Every attempt felt calculated, like they were testing the waters to see if they could get anything out of me. I declined every invitation, knowing it was the only way to protect myself. To ensure there were no more surprises, my grandparents finalized their estate plan. They took every precaution to make sure my parents couldn't contest anything after they were gone. It was sad that it had to come to this, but it was also a relief knowing everything was taken care of. Then the harassment started. I began receiving threatening emails, anonymous but clearly written by my parents. They contained thinly veiled threats and guilt-laden messages about family duty. I filed a police report and added extra security measures around my home. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. Not long after, their situation took another turn for the worse. They were evicted from their rental home after failing to pay rent for months. They tried reaching out to extended family for help, but no one was willing to give them a hand. They had burned too many bridges, and now they were facing the consequences of their actions. Eventually, I decided to leave my small town behind. I moved to a new city, started fresh, and left the toxic memories behind. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. My parents' manipulations and drama were no longer a part of my life, and I was ready to build something better for myself. Peace, at last. Update 5. Years have passed since I cut ties with my parents, and my life is unrecognizable from what it used to be. Moving to a new city and leaving the toxic memories behind was the best decision I ever made. I've grown in ways I didn't think were possible back when I was constantly dealing with their manipulation. My grandparents remained my greatest support system during that time, and I'll forever be grateful for everything they gave me, not just financially, but emotionally. About a year ago, my grandparents passed away within months of each other. My grandfather went first, peacefully in his sleep, and my grandmother followed not long after. Losing them was one of the hardest things I've ever experienced, but knowing they lived full lives and left behind a legacy of love brought me some comfort. They had planned everything meticulously, and their estate was divided exactly as they intended. They made sure I was protected, and when my parents inevitably tried to contest the will, they were swiftly dismissed by the court. My grandparents' lawyer had ensured there were no loopholes, and my parents didn't stand a chance. Shortly after the court ruling, I received a letter from my mother. It was unexpected, and for a moment, I debated whether to read it at all. The letter was an apology, sort of. She acknowledged some of the pain they caused but spent most of it justifying their actions. She wrote about how hard life had been for them, and how they always felt overshadowed by my grandparents. It was more of the same excuses, wrapped in a thin veneer of regret. I decided not to respond. Some things are better left in the past. On a brighter note, my career has flourished in ways I never imagined. I recently hit a major milestone, something I'd been working toward for years. It was the kind of success I wish my grandparents could have seen because they were the ones who made it possible. In their honor, I dedicated the achievement to them publicly, sharing how their love and guidance shaped my life. Inspired by their generosity, I used a portion of the inheritance to establish a scholarship fund in their name. The fund helps students from underprivileged backgrounds pursue higher education, just as my grandparents helped me. The response has been incredible. The scholarship gained local attention, and I was invited to speak about my grandparents' impact on my life. It felt like a full circle moment, sharing their story and their values with others. As for my parents, the last I heard, they were living in a small, run-down apartment. They've alienated just about everyone around them. Even the distant family members who once felt sorry for them have distanced themselves, tired of the endless drama and entitlement. It's a sad outcome, but one they brought on themselves. Despite everything, I've come to terms with what happened. I'll never forget what my parents did, but I've chosen to let go of the anger. Holding on to it doesn't serve me anymore, and I refuse to let their actions define the rest of my life. Forgiveness, in my case, doesn't mean reconciliation. It just means I'm no longer carrying their burden. In an effort to build the kind of family I always wanted, I've reconnected with my extended relatives. Last summer, I hosted a family gathering at my new home, inviting cousins, aunts, and uncles. It was a warm, joyful event filled with laughter and connection. For the first time, I felt like I had the family I'd always longed for. I also took some symbolic steps to let go of the past. I donated a few of my parents' old belongings to charity, items they'd left behind in the chaos of their eviction. It felt freeing to part with those things, like I was closing a chapter for good. Before my childhood home was sold at auction, I visited it one last time. Walking through the empty rooms brought a mix of emotions. I felt sadness for what could have been and relief that I was no longer tied to that place. It was bittersweet, but ultimately it gave me the closure I needed. On a more personal note, I've started dating someone who shares my values. They understand the importance of boundaries and have been incredibly supportive of my journey. It's been refreshing to build a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. The scholarship fund has continued to grow, and I've received so many touching messages from students who've benefited from it. Knowing that my grandparents' legacy is helping others achieve their dreams fills me with pride. It's a way to keep their memory alive and honor everything they stood for. My parents made one last attempt to contact me recently. They sent a desperate message through a mutual acquaintance, claiming they wanted to make things right. I didn't respond. I've learned that engaging with them only reopens wounds that are better left healed. Ignoring that message felt like finally breaking the cycle of manipulation. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far I've come. My career is thriving, I have strong friendships, and I've created a chosen family that fills my life with joy. Most importantly, I've found peace. Cutting ties with my parents was the hardest decision I've ever made, but it was also the best one. I'm finally living the life I deserve, free from their toxicity, and I know my grandparents would be proud.